Francesco and Barbara, and we already have our guests on the line.
Really appreciate that. It's at, can the guests see us, or is it only via audio?
They can.
Can see us.
They can, so that is good, because then I introduce everybody in a second. But let me first welcome you, and sorry for the slight delay, my apologies. I'm actually the chair of the B team, I'm Paul Polman, and it's certainly an incredible pleasure to have you all join us today, and I thank you for taking the time to be here at the G7 media briefing. This is actually an event that is hosted, as you will see, by a number of global business organizations and networks who view themselves as critical friends of the G7 countries and are committed to business action which builds a more inclusive and, I would say, greener economy. And these groups represent trillions of dollars of turnover and hundreds of millions of employees, if you want to. Together, these groups have aligned on a common policy proposal, which we would like to share with you, obviously following this call, so that you can get a little bit more information. As perhaps Hala has mentioned, the conversation will be recorded and is on the record. And we're actually pleased to have invited three incredible CEOs here with us to speak to you today. The first one is Francesco Starace, who is the CEO and General Manager of Enel. The second one is Oliver Bäte, who is the CEO of Allianz. And then we have Barbara Humpton. Hello, Barbara, President and CEO of Siemens USA. Thank you all three for joining us. As you can see, they represent actually different companies from different G7 countries who actually represent three different sectors, yet they are aligned in the support of one ambitious agenda. We certainly will hear from them their opening remarks and then what they expect from the Leaders Summit, and then I'll turn it to all of you listening in for a 20-25 minutes Q&A, if you don't mind. I would argue that this year's G7 summit is perhaps the most important one in a decade. It comes at a moment where the G7 must deal with a still acute COVID emergency, whilst relaunching the global economy at the same time and building the foundations for sustainable growth. G7 leaders, as well as the invited four countries that you know, South Africa, India, South Korea, and Australia, must prove that multilateralism is still alive and must make major progress on vaccines, finance solidarity, domestic green recovery, and signal that real political action on climate, energy, and nature that everybody is looking for. We cannot miss that opportunity. Now, some things have already been accomplished by the G7 this year, so we have some momentum and start from a stronger base than perhaps many of us expected a year or two ago. The environment and climate ministers agreed to align short, medium, and long-term policies with the science-based 1.5-degree pathway, including recognition of the need for deep emission cuts in the 2020s to halve and reverse nature loss at the same time by 2030, to phase out coal, to align financial flows to ensure that these objectives can be met. As you know, and many of you have written about it, the devil obviously is in the detail, and particularly the deadlines to do all of this. Then the finance ministers have met and committed to a global minimum tax, a very significant outcome, I believe, that I've separately written about, which represents a significant step towards sustainable financial reforms. They've also sent a positive signal on vaccine equity, debt reform, climate-related financial disclosure, and climate finance. However, more specific and time-bound commitments are urgently needed to address these issues and to meet the respective goals. Furthermore, the finance communique, as you've seen, contains, in our opinion, key omissions. In particular, no mention of the coal phase-out of fossil fuel subsidy reforms. However, today, our business leaders will speak to their hopes and expectations of what else can be agreed at this weekend's Leaders Summit. We hope that the leaders can agree first on securing a healthy, green and just recovery at home in their own countries, in the G7 countries. To do that, policy actions must ensure we have a chance of keeping the 1.5 degrees within reach and deliver a net zero economy through a just transition by halving emissions by 2030 in just 8 years' time. The International Energy Agency, in their recent report, has also again lent some credibility that this is by all means possible. Leaders must signal also a commitment to phasing out the use of coal by 2030 and coal export by 2025. And they must commit to phasing out domestic and overseas fossil fuel subsidies and shifting investments into nature and green industries by 2025. The second thing that we need to do, next to bringing our own houses in order in the G7 countries, is to enable a healthy, green, and just recovery through signaling global solidarity, rebuilding resilience for those populations most vulnerable to the impacts of COVID-19. That the climate crisis has pointed out the enormous economic inequalities. So therefore, we want the leaders to focus on lending the excess doses, commit to sharing these doses of vaccines in a timely and effective manner by sharing at least 100 million doses through COVAX that we should be able to do, close the financing gap, commit to meeting the COVID funding targets, a pittance compared to what these countries have spent to rescuing their own economies, and then obviously ensuring that there is enough production, working with the WTO, the WHO, and others to make these vaccines available everywhere. And some people have alluded to the voluntary licensing in that respect. The third thing that we want to point out is about financing, to ensure that our financing of the future will be green financing, just and comprehensive. And that requires a reform of the financial system and an alignment of public and private investments, obviously in line with the Paris agreements and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. All G7 nations should consider how to recover from the COVID crisis and prevent the climate crisis and manage equity by first and foremost committing to the $100 billion to the low and middle income countries in what we call the climate financing support, the famous 100 billion of the climate fund. And again, it is like going to the dentist, how long it takes us to put that money on the table. And that unfortunately doesn't build trust by these low and middle income countries. And that might seriously undermine what we can expect of the COP26. More than 100 low and middle income countries actually have expressed the need for international support, also for technology development and transfer of that technology to implement these nationally determined commitments. Finally, if the private sector wants to play their part in raising the revenues, the G7 will also have to not only consider a minimum corporate tax rate, but also things like a price on carbon. And as far as the tax rate are concerned, a minimum tax rate isn't, in this case, punitive to businesses already paying their fair share, but it will certainly, we believe, tackle the tax avoidance by what we might call the bad actors. It will level the playing field and hopefully sets a standard to raise this over time and use that revenue to invest in the green, inclusive, and just recovery that we're all talking about. With that, let me hand it over to my friend Francesco, first and foremost, to give his points of view from an Enel and industry perspective around the energy sector. Francesco, the floor is yours.
Let me unmute myself. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor really to be with the B team. I just want to spend a few minutes to, let's say, advocate for some of the issues that we really think are central for the development of the agenda in the next few months. And these have to do with, of course, those areas of the activities where we are more active. And basically, what has to do with carbon and its presence in our energy mix. Anything that can be done in order to push carbon out of the heavy use of energy that today we have around the world. We noticed that the G7 has made substantial progress in some of these areas. We noticed that, for example, there is a great emphasis on climate finance, and we think that climate finance is today a very promising new tool in the fight against climate change. We have been a major issuer of SDG-linked bonds in the world since 2019. It's just a coincidence, but today we announced a 3.5 bond issue on SDG-linked logics. We think there is an incredible capability of financing SDG activities around the world out there that not all finance ministers and not all companies still grasp in its dimension. So my first recommendation would be to really focus on what all this money ready to be put to work can do to help the agenda. The second one is perhaps a little bit a surprise. We noticed that although the world is phasing out coal, there is little mention of that in the SDG, in the G7 finance ministers report. So we think this is perhaps just a lapse. We believe this should not be left aside, but the attention to limit the amount of money that goes into new coal projects and the progressive closure of existing coal plants is really money well spent, and it is indeed going to the objective. Finally, we think that ending fossil fuel subsidies, direct or indirect, or be they fiscal exemptions or just money right there, is really important to push money in the right direction and avoid stranded assets along the next 10 years. In brief, we think that the next 10 years, so between now and 2030, we need to really focus on what technologies are available to help decarbonize and electrify societies without fear and without concern. We know that this is for the benefit of the growth of economy worldwide, and it can be done with existing technologies nowadays. So we are not talking about science fiction here. We're talking about things that exist that need to be pushed thoroughly and with decision. We believe that during these 10 years, then there will be time to work and make additional technologies available on commercial basis in order to further push the decarbonization agenda and the transition in the years, in the 40 and the 50 decades. On disclosure, I think it's an important point. And I think here, we have made as Enel a big commitment to make a fully integrated reporting of where we go with our sustainability agenda, not only on climate, but on all the 3 ESG dimensions. And we have also linked the remuneration packages of management to KPIs that have to do with this dimension. We think this is a powerful and today available way of pushing many companies, and why not also public entities, into the right direction. And we believe that the work that has been done on ESG metrics today allows for precise metrics to be deployed in order for this to be carried out. So I believe that there should be some more emphasis on disclosures, and we believe that it should be made mandatory to have climate-related financial disclosure by companies and related subcontractors along the value chain. And finally, and I don't want to take more time on that, I can add one thing, that the big results that was achieved on the global minimum tax should not be considered the end of a trip. I think it's been a major accomplishment, and I have really to commend and compliment all the finance ministers that reached it. I think it's a big starting point for a more equitable and more simple and also more sustainable financial reform that needs to happen in the future. So thank you for the time, and I leave time for the other speakers and also for some questions.
Well, thanks, Francesco. I'll hand it immediately over to Oliver. Oliver, go ahead.
Oliver, unmute yourself.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Paul. And Francesco has hit already the most important point that I would just like to augment as we're working together. More and more businesses are helping and trying to help governments to drive the agenda, as it was already the case in Paris. I would like to make 4 concrete points. The first one is on the disclosures. Just to reiterate, we just have to make sure that we don't end up with a cacophony of different frameworks. The US has one, Europe has one, another one. So we need to really push for harmonization of certain minimum standards, and then there can be differences between the pieces. On the disclosures, we need to recognize that there are target states for companies to be reached by 2050, but there has to be transitions. So the most important thing is now to hone in on the concrete short-term plans to get to 2030 and show actionable items that will deliver the beneficial outcomes. So we have a lot of statements now. 60% of world GDP governments have committed to net zero. Very little has been done in terms of saying how exactly are we going to go there by industry. And that is what really we need now, and we need to do quickly. And whether that's our UN Convened Asset Owner Alliance or others, this is what we are trying to target. And the same we need. And therefore, we also in Germany like to say, put your money where your mouth is. The most astounding thing is that government-run money, particularly sovereign wealth funds and sovereign pension funds, many of them have not yet committed to net zero. And if I was like you, a journalist, which I'm not, the first question I would ask, if you're really serious, why don't you put the money that is supposed to finance this transition that you control? Why are you not committing net zero for that? So it's the first intuitive question that even my kids have been asking. And so there's a big gap between aspiration and concrete action, even for the money that is under government control. The third comment I'd like to make is there's a lot of talk about other measures, particularly around carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is essential, but it doesn't help if it doesn't lead to capital reallocation. What am I trying to say? In Germany now, like in many other countries, solar power stations and wind farms are as economically viable as other energy sources if you strip out the subsidies, as Francesco has said. Unfortunately, increase in carbon pricing is not increasing wind power. Why? It's not because markets don't function, but we don't get approvals to build wind power stations and solar power stations because, in difference to what politicians say, the approvals are not coming and the new energy sources are not being built. And if they're being built, they take 8 years, in difference to, for example, 2 years in the United States from initiation. So we need to hold governments accountable, not sure of what they say, but what they credibly do. And in this case, again, carbon price will only help if we get capital reallocation, get permits to build new energy sources, and we need to build them now. Last but not least, that I'd like to say is we have never had a time, and Paul said it, where there's so much movement. Let's move from commitments to real plans that you can check whether they're credible with our people. Let's not end up with the promises that we have in our pension system where we kick the can down to our children and says, by 2040, somebody else will come up with a solution how to finance all these pensions and how to pay back all this debt. We need to do the things now. Thank you.
No, thanks, Oliver. And then I'll hand it over right away to Barbara. Barbara, go ahead.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you to the B team for hosting us for this important discussion. Let me begin with a couple of comments about the vaccine, where, Paul, I know you had begun this conversation. It's part of it. At Siemens, we've been engaged in the vaccine development process through our software. A lot of people don't know that. It was actually used by pharmaceutical companies to accelerate the development timelines. And the focus on equitable distribution reflects the commitment of our Siemens Foundation, which has made grants to a number of nonprofit organizations working to advance vaccine distribution and adoption among the communities most affected by the pandemic. And I want to share just a couple of quick comments with you about why Siemens is supporting bold action on climate by governments worldwide. If you go back to 2015, Siemens was the first global industrial company to commit to 100% carbon neutrality by 2030. We're now past the halfway point in our journey. So we've been deeply committed to sustainability and doing our own part to address climate change. Yet an important part of the reason we made such a public commitment was because we wanted to demonstrate to customers, to industries, to government leaders that the technology needed to decarbonize and electrify the world is in the marketplace and ready to be used. So Siemens was among more than 400 companies that signed the open letter encouraging the Biden administration to move forward with its climate agenda and to set national targets for reducing emissions aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement. And we're optimistic that the United States engaging in this effort on the global stage with G7 nations will strengthen a government framework that accelerates timelines and unleashes private sector innovation. It sets the stage to make this decade one of action. We're also part of the climate group's RE100, EP100, and EV100 initiatives, joining a collective commitment as we work towards sourcing 100% renewable electricity, switching to net zero buildings, and electrifying our fleets, all by the end of this decade. We see this attention to the decarbonization of society, in particular, when we look at policies supporting the electrification of transportation. We all know that the transformation of this sector will lead to significant reductions in carbon emissions, significant increases in air quality. But we'll need the charging infrastructure to make it happen. And it's through a national charging network strategy that we can set in motion the deployment of the right technology to enable the widespread electrification of personal cars, company fleets, and public transit as communities work to lower their emissions and improve that air quality. It's important to our own EV market, but it's also important to how we position ourselves to compete globally in what we know will be a major market of the future. And at the same time, the private sector can and should set its own example. I'll make this my final point. Fighting climate change isn't just a space for leadership and social responsibility. It is a good business decision. And what that means is that we can protect the planet and produce cleaner air while also creating jobs and fueling economic recovery and building a more resilient future. We see financing models like energy as a service really helping to pave the way for schools, hospitals, universities, and others to meet their sustainability goals, to save on costs and have greater control over their assets. And by expanding access to pathways for decarbonization that were financially worthwhile, we can usher in an energy revolution across society writ large. I look forward to continuing the discussion. I'm actually excited about the questions you might have, and even more so, the progress we can achieve together. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And you've heard from three great leaders, different industries, but I think always a consistent message. A consistent message to first and foremost take care of our lives and livelihoods and be responsible global citizens on the vaccines. It affects us all, and no healthy planet until we're all healthy. We've seen the enormous cost that we're incurring and the pittance that we need to spend to actually take care of our people. That equation needs to be addressed, and vaccine availability is one of them. We've seen our second point to be made in terms of aggressive targets for the countries itself between now and 2030. And all three speakers talked about the differences between talking the talk and walking the talk. So can we close that gap between what we say we're going to do and what we're actually doing? And coal being a very important one, nature-based solutions we talked about. And the third area is global solidarity, not only on vaccines, but also to ensure that we have the climate financing, that we helped the emerging markets, and that we broadly move the financial markets forward. What we have seen during the recovery, that 8 out of the $10 were non-conditional and frankly did not help us move into the right economies that we needed. And hopefully now as the G7, we have an opportunity to address that. I'll open it up with questions now for each of our leaders here present. So if you want to kick it off, the ones that are listening in, just only state for whom you work with magazines, so we know, or newspapers or media outlets, so we know this, and state your name, and then we'll get immediately into the discussions. We have about 30 minutes to do that. That should be ample time. Who wants to kick it off? And by the way, you can put questions in the chat as well if you want to, so that we can see that. Go ahead. Who wants to kick it off? There are any questions coming in? You can wait for a second. Perhaps I can just start kicking it off already, and some of you are alluding to the minimum tax rate with the G7. There's a lot of little dots that need to be put on the I still to make that come alive. But does any of you want to comment on the minimum tax rate as you see it, and some of the things that need to be done moving forward?
You know, perhaps, Paul, I can add this, that no one likes to talk about taxes. It's a typical bad word to have in any debate, and in particular with politicians. It's a really taboo word. But I think the fact that this time it was addressed, and not only addressed, but also some kind of agreement was reached, which was then obviously criticized back and forth, because all agreements are debatable, if you want. I think it's a monumental step, in my opinion, in the world today. Looking at where the world is going, how is it diverging in many ways, the fact that there is kind of a minimum agreement on taxation is a major milestone.
Yeah, and years of work with the OECD, 139 countries, now going to the G20.
Yeah, it's a very encouraging sign.
Yeah, having a minimum floor, as we saw with Paris, is probably the best way to ratchet it up over time. But also key that the money will be spent on greening the global economy and not missing that opportunity. I think we have if you have any questions, what I can just ask you is raise your hands, and the B team will deal with that. We cannot see it on this screen, but perhaps we can move forward already to the next question.
I think there is a question from...
Can you see them? Because I can't.
Heather Landy. Yeah, there is a question from Heather Landy that says...
I got it. Okay.
What are the most important things the G7 could do to trigger the short-term actions needed in order to meet the longer-term goals? And is the private sector in a better position to start that process? It's just a question that came in from Heather Landy. Who wants to take that? Most important thing they can do now for long-term goals, and is the private sector in a better position to start that
Paul,
process?
let me lean in on this one, because I'll share with you a perspective from the US, and that is, you probably noticed US businesses stepping forward and being active, even when the US was not active on the global stage in terms of climate agreement. The private sector does, in fact, manage so many of the assets responsible for the issues we're dealing with. And it's the private sector who has indeed seen the need for responsibility here. And the fact that action here is going to help in terms of our overall economic performance. So this is very much a virtuous cycle, especially now that the financial sector has gotten deeply engaged in this. I think I look forward to seeing the massive momentum that is building, because investors more and more are understanding that how they vote with their dollars makes a big difference in the results we will see in the private sector. Now, what can we do to actually accelerate that further? You'll see a lot of companies like ours began voluntarily disclosing. We built a sustainability report and published it a decade ago and have been doing so every year. We now are working with many of the frameworks to select the right kinds of measurements for us to be sharing broadly, so that we, along with other businesses, can begin to compare our results and thus learn from each other. So we are on a voyage of joint discovery. There is a lot to learn as we move forward, and the private sector can play a huge role in lifting each other up.
Thanks, Barbara. One of the things that was mentioned before as well, I think it was by Oliver, was the need for more transparency and mandatory reporting. Perhaps you can
give your thoughts on that a little bit more. Very much.
Yeah. So we have more reporting from the private sector than actually on action planning, and we do sector pathways now, also for GFANs, i.e. the financial sector now, than we have from governments. So Paul, as you said earlier, they have committed to coal phase out. It was not mentioned. So that's what we have to do by 2030. And then the second question is, show us for each of the G7 how you're going to phase out coal by 2030. Very simple. Put the first foot forward and then put the second foot forward. So that will build credibility with populations, and that will also require us to tell, where's the money for that, what we will do with the communities that will be at risk, because there will be economic hardships coming from that. So we need to have very clear action items that make these things happen in the transition that's good for. And I would start with that. We have that. That would be my advice. Show something that works.
And you can see Oliver's impatience and sense of urgency, because when he said by 2:30, I thought that's later this afternoon, but he means 2030. But it needs to be done now. So I agree with that. There's a good question that is coming in from Terry Slavin, which says, given the fact that we have to cut emissions by 50% by 2030, should companies with net zero commitments be required to set interim goals for 2025? Remember, we had 250 goals. Moving to the 2030 discussions, should we set goals for 2025 as well? And should they also be required to offer green pensions as the default to their workforce? Francesco.
Yeah, maybe I think, why not? Clearly there are companies and companies, and I think there are companies that for whom the 2023-24 time horizon is already today, and others that can do things that already have an impact in 22. So I believe there is nothing magic about 2030 in terms of commitment for companies. And I believe that a 2025 interim milestone would probably be good for companies that have a quick cycle and or are really relatively low on the emissions already. Let's not forget also that we have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And in some cases, the scope 2 and scope 3 emissions take longer than the scope 1 emissions. I mean, it's just because it has to go through the whole value chain, which is not a simple thing. So all in all, I think it makes sense to have a 25 deadline, yes. I also believe that this green pensions idea would probably make sense, but it has to be carefully studied together with the representative of the labor forces. I mean, the fact that the pension is green doesn't necessarily qualify for it to be acceptable to all workers under all conditions. So it's a great idea. I've myself was puzzled by the definition the first time I looked at it. But again, we have to be careful. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people that are really looking at this as something that has to do with their future in the next 20, 30 years. So it has to be done with the agreement of the workforce representatives worldwide.
You raise a very valid point in the beginning, Francesco, that companies that outsource their value chains not outsource their responsibilities. You have to take most of the carbon emission is in your value chain, and the scope 3 is very important. What we have now seen is that governments are being held to account. We saw it in Germany, we see it in the Netherlands, we see it in some of the other places. They're increasingly being challenged by the courts, Australia even, to make more aggressive commitments and implement them. And we see companies that actually are too slow being called to account. The current season of shareholder propositions is really a wake-up call. More propositions around ESG and especially climate change than anything else. We all quote the Chevrons or the Shells or the Exxons, but there are many others now emerging at a higher pace. So we feel very strongly that we need to be on the front foot, but also need the help of the governments to be equally proactive in setting the targets. The Michael Holder has raised his hand. So Michael, why don't I give you the floor if we can hear you? You have to unmute, Michael.
Hiya. Yeah, hi, it's Michael from Business Green. Thanks for taking the time to speak to everyone today. Great to see you. Yeah, I'd just be interested to hear the panelists reflect on the UK's leadership on climate and the environment in 2021, given, it set some ambitious goals itself. It's helped bring the G7 together on a few key issues, but is there also perhaps some frustration of its failure to be consistent in its message, tacitly approving a coal mine, for example, or failing to commit on further exploration for North Sea gas and oil, cutting its aid obligations a percentage of GDP. So I just wondered what your message would be to the UK government this year.
Does anybody want to pick it up, or I'm the only one living in the UK, I guess. So I'll pick it up. I should take it. But what you mentioned it clearly, what some of the challenges are and how difficult it is. We've also seen that in the US, where, for example, the Biden administration, Michael, has stepped up truly under the leadership of the president and John Kerry, their actions on climate change, and built it into all of their departments, if you want to, and all of their actions. But then how difficult the realities are, where you have to get consensus, where you have to look at projects that are already running, and where you have to find a path that really embraces everybody to make it possible. So there is a realistic side that we need to be aware of. Having said that, coming back to the UK, there absolutely is a need that despite the great announcements that the UK has made on the, for example, the reductions by 2035 and some of the policy changes that we've made, that we continuously point out where there are some inconsistencies. The 0.7 going to 0.5 has gotten an enormous attention and pressure on the current G7. We've all written the letters. There are many action groups talking about that. And may I say, over 40 Conservative members of Parliament themselves have raised the issue. And I think Boris Johnson would be well served, as I've said many times publicly, to reconsider what was actually enshrined in law in the UK and to go back to the 0.7%. A small number with big benefits. The emerging markets, once more, are looking at just some signs of support, of solidarity, before they can also really commit to the bolder commitments that are needed for the COP26. So putting it in that broader perspective is very important. Likewise, with the vaccine availability would be the other part of that. It is just a pittance of what we have made available to these emerging markets, about 5% of everything, even today, whilst we know that if we don't attack this issue globally, we'll get further mutations and give them fancier names. And ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, estimated a $9 trillion potential cost to the global economy if we don't attack this in solidarity. So the UK is in an ideal position with Italy, may I say, with the G20, with Francesco is also actively involved in, to continue to put this high on the agenda and to make sure that we deliver with clear actions now to create that confidence. We are next to Michael. I cannot see if there are other hands moving up. If any other comments coming in? If we don't, then I'll just take a other one be on the government itself and the vaccine rollout. You all three as companies have been actively involved in that. We have talked about COVAX and the need to replenish COVAX. Perhaps it's good to hear to give the journalist a little indicator of why it is so important for companies. Why are companies calling for this? And to tell governments what seems to be obvious to us. But why is it so obvious to companies to call for this broader availability of vaccines?
Well, if I can add, we have a presence in many parts of the world, and we are a presence in Europe, which is pretty large. In the US, we have a presence in Mexico and a lot of countries in Latin America, including Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Peru. And we have presence in South Africa and India. So how can you work effectively if your workforce is spread across parts of the world where vaccinations are starting to work and parts of the world where vaccinations are not starting at all. This is really a problem. It's not just a moral problem or a problem of inequity that needs to be addressed. It's a problem of efficiency and way of working. How can you ask parts of your company to perform in a different way just because they are still in a lockdown and others that are not? So this is really becoming imperative to be fixed if we want the economy of the world to finally stop going in this sinusoidal back and forth resonance way and align in a steady growth as we all want. And the faster this happens, the better the supply chain tensions will finally ease and we will get back to a more efficient economy. I am afraid that if we don't do that, we will have a continuous back and forth of lockdowns in different times of around the world, which will reverberate in global supply chain tensions, global gluts in the logistics, and a lot of dysfunction potential around the world. Now, if we look at the numbers, we have 2.2 billion people that have been inoculated a vaccine dose right now. This is the data of Johns Hopkins. So let's assume that these people would agree to pay for other 2 vaccinations for somebody else. The money is not an issue. I mean, who would say, I don't want to pay for other 2 fellows to be vaccinated? I'll pay for that. And many of us would probably be able to pay for hundreds of them. But all in all, I think it's a question of willingness, but I'm sure that a large crowdfunding exercise or some kind of global initiative would find the money. What we know is that the logistics and the production of all this vaccine is a monumental task that requires a monumental global effort, which money can fund, but it needs to be done by people. And so the COVAX issue is not just a question of funding, but it's also a question of dedicating enough resources physically to this job. And we've seen what it takes to vaccinate a country. It's not a small endeavor. So that now needs to be replicated on a global scale quickly. Otherwise, we will go into continuous turbulence in the economic cycle as a consequence of not having vaccinated the world in the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Francesco, you've said it incredibly well. And now taking the lens from the global level to even a country level,
sure.
Think about the United States, where vaccination rates are incredibly high. We're also seeing a real variation amongst various populations. And so we at Siemens have devoted our time, treasure, and talent to helping to address some of those issues. If you look back over the last 18 months, what you'll see is the Siemens Corporation reaching out through our Siemens Healthineers colleagues, helping to ramp up testing protocols, helping to ensure that historically Black colleges and universities stay open. And we've actually worked through our Siemens Foundation, and we've invested over $7 million in reaching communities that are particularly exposed to the health threats posed by COVID. So, everything like donations to community health facilities, to vaccine outreach and distribution efforts in Black, Latinx, and in indigenous communities. These have all been communities at risk. And we need to be thinking about exactly what Francesco said, the business implications. We know that a healthy society can help with this healthy business environment we're all striving for.
I appreciate that. Could not agree more. I have one final question for all of you, and that comes back to what Oliver was saying before, is the say-do gap. During the pandemic, we have seen that more money went to shovel-ready projects that actually benefited more the fossil fuel than the green energy. We've also seen that 8 out of $10 that was spent had no conditions attached to it. Airlines being supported, car industries, and others that we're well familiar with, pushing us in to some extent back. Although we see
a more encouraging picture than at the time of the financial crisis 10, 12 years ago. We still have a long way to go, indeed, to close this promise gap versus the say gap versus the do gap. Question to all of you as a final comment is, what are the one or two most important things that business should be doing to keep holding our governments to account? Who wants to kick it off?
Maybe I can just say that I think what we really need to achieve here is that our governments understand the difference in the times of this effort. So what needs to be done right now for the next 8-9 years to get to 2030 cannot wait any debate and should be done without hesitation, because it can be done. And it would be crazy to sit now in 2028 or 29 and see 2030 coming saying, what were we talking about in 2022, 21, 2020? We knew this was going on. So it's just time to just do what we all know needs to be done and what more or less we agree roughly needs to be done there. And then, please don't get me wrong, if another car is manufactured with the wrong engine, who cares? But the big thing is that we need to go in that direction and stop discussing. And then don't mix science fiction with what we have today. Science fiction, so all the new fancy stuff that will need to be there by 2040, 2050, yes, it needs to be worked in R&D departments, it needs to work in universities, it needs to become mature, but it's not there yet. So let's work with what we have. I think that's really what we would like to see. Governments understand science fiction and present technologies. What's the difference?
Yeah, thanks. Oliver, Barbara?
No, I have nothing to add to what Francesco said. And we can help, we can business say these things are there, so do them. So what business can do is to point out what Francesco said, put it in writing, and then our cherished listeners can pick that up and say, here are the technologies that actually do work. And as you said, Paul, why do we have fossil fuel subsidies? I just don't get an answer.
Yeah.
Francesco, Oliver, couldn't agree more, being grounded in the practical reality of today, but having an optimistic outlook, having a bright vision of the future that is possible to achieve. That's key. A lot of people need to have the picture painted for them. And I'll share with everyone, this is one reason why my team worked with me to launch a podcast series this year called The Optimistic Outlook. And I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to hear a series of dialogues with leaders in various sectors, from the transportation sector to the buildings and infrastructure sector, people talking about their vision of a bright future that is more sustainable and more equitable. And then hearing from experts about how we can work together. Now, I personally have shared my optimistic outlook using all of this collected information in an open letter to government. An open letter that laid out 5 priorities for infrastructure, where we will, in fact, be able to make giant steps forward in our climate initiatives with the stimulus funding that governments all around the world are looking to deploy right now. So here in the US, for every dollar spent, can it be spent toward a more sustainable, more equitable, more resilient future? That's the goal. And I think businesses are in a unique position to help our governments understand the art of the possible.
Well said, and I thank you for all 3 of you, your honest responses. Increasingly, we're also able to measure things better than what we were able to do before, and we're seeing now that once more the cost of inaction continues to go up quite rapidly, whilst the cost of action, thanks to technology, critical mass, is actually going down. And it turns out that greening our economies, creating the jobs in the electric vehicles or retrofitting buildings, restoring biodiversity, making our infrastructures resilient, not only creates more jobs, not only are better jobs, not only give you a higher return on investment, but more importantly, create the world that we and future generations can live in. And this is probably the ultimate and most important thing for business. We certainly cannot succeed in societies that fail. And we also, as you hear from this panel, cannot be bystanders in a system that gives us life in the first place. Here you saw 3 incredibly responsible and great business leaders talking about different industries and the actions they want the G7 leaders to take. And I hope that you got some ideas and some thoughts to put also in print to hopefully start the broader movement of action and close this say-do gap. I thank you all for your time. I thank you for joining us today for this wonderful get-together organized by the B team, an organization of great leaders who know that there are alternative ways of doing business and who understand that business should not be the cause of the problems we're trying to solve, but actively participate in the solutions. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you at our next occasions. Thanks, everybody.